Even after centuries of science and rationalism, miracles are still proclaimed genuine by the Catholic Church. The Vatican has officially pronounced that this man was miraculously saved from certain death from bone marrow failure as he prayed at the tomb of a 19th century priest in the Lebanon. This woman, it seems, was miraculously cured as a young girl of a malignant tumor in her leg through the intercession of Our Lady of Lourdes. Yet the Church does not accept such claimed miracles easily. They are investigated with great rigor, often with the involvement of eminent doctors and scientists. EQUINOX asks whether science and religion can really work together in such harmony as it follows the work of the miracle police.
As Catholics and as a theologian, as a professor of theology, I do believe in miracles.
I'm very skeptical of what's called a miracle. A miracle by its very name is something that is inexplicable to science.
Science and theology cannot be in conflict since there is the one author of both, who is God.
The Catholic Church cannot dismiss the miraculous out of hand, not least because the Christian faith is based on the miracle of Christ's resurrection as a sign of his divinity. So if the Church embraces science in investigating the apparently supernatural, is there not a danger that such rationalism will undermine basic faith and beliefs which are not open to scientific proofs?
It's a mistake, I think, for the Church to try to use science to prove things, because the supernatural is not amenable to this kind of demonstration.
In Worcester, Massachusetts, scientists have been asked to look into a remarkable series of alleged miracles as part of a commission appointed by the local Catholic bishop. It's his responsibility to investigate claims of the supernatural made in the Church's name, especially when public and media clamor cannot be ignored. Such is the case with the events surrounding a young girl, Audrey Santo, who was left in a coma after a swimming pool accident in 1987.
Since her release from the hospital 9 years ago, Audrey's condition is virtually the same. She remains in a form of coma known as akinetic mutism, literally a non-moving, non-talking state. Although able to breathe on her own, Audrey is partially dependent on a tracheostomy tube in her neck, connected to a breathing machine.
Audrey is at the center of an investigation by Worcester's Bishop Daniel Riley. 2 years after her accident, sensational events began to be reported around her, some of them witnessed by Catholic priests. Stigmata, unexpected cures, bleeding Eucharists, statues moving of their own accord, or dripping oil.
Since October 1994, more than 36 holy images in Audrey's room and the chapel had secreted oil or blood.
This documentary was made by a Catholic production company, the Mercy Foundation. In the most ordinary of American suburbs, the Santo home has become a place of pilgrimage, by appointment only, every Wednesday. The waiting list for a visit stretches until the end of the millennium.
The time has come, Bishop feels, that we really need to look at this. This has been going on for several years. We're hearing all these reports. Let's see what credence there is. So let's do some investigations here. So, because people are asking, what is the Church's position on this? How does the Church view this? Should we believe these things?
Apart from a theological member, the Bishop's investigating commission comprises 2 highly qualified clinical psychologists, both Catholics, who will be looking into the case for several months, a process that would normally be completely secret. Dr. Robert Giotoni has 30 years' experience in his field and is a visiting professor at Clark University. Dr. John Madonna is a member of the American College of Forensic Examiners. They will spend up to 24 hours at a time in the Santo home and observe the Wednesday gatherings in the course of their investigation, which is divided into different psychological categories.
There's a general category of factitiousness that we refer to, which would be some kind of chicanery or some kind of possibly deceitfulness, intentional or not. Also, we're looking at the possibility of hysterical phenomena operating, the kinds of psychological circumstances in which emotions overtake intellect and create an experience that really cannot be objectively defined.
Group dynamics as well, the contagion effect, when people get together in a context like this, there very often is a propensity for people to induce each other with certain feelings, and so we're very mindful of that and trying to get a clear perspective on whether or not that's taking place, and if so, to what extent.
The psychologists will be inviting independent experts, including a non-Catholic pediatrician, to help in their investigation. They'll also be interviewing witnesses about the strange goings-on at the Santo home.
I've seen things here. I've seen a lot of phenomena. Some of them people would say are miraculous.
Visitors began to report a strong aroma of roses in Audrey's presence. Many experienced physical healings or dramatic spiritual awakenings.
Audrey's mother herself witnessed one of the most remarkable alleged phenomena when the tabernacle in Audrey's bedroom was opened one Good Friday.
There was a pool of blood on the floor of the tabernacle. It was incredible. I can tell you there wasn't a dry eye in the room.
Such is the desire to see the miraculous in the everyday that these marks on Audrey's hands were interpreted by some as stigmata.
These wounds of Christ are widely viewed by church authorities as a gift from God and a physical sign of a soul's intimacy with Christ.
Audrey's family devote a large amount of their time to caring for her, but who can know for sure what, if anything, she makes of her situation?
Another related aspect that we are attending to is the extent to which Audrey's dignity as an individual is maintained and not submerged in all that occurs around her.
As the investigation is still in progress, no prediction of its findings is allowed. But in any case, startling conclusions should not be expected.
It would be foolhardy to say that a definitive conclusion can be reached in any form of clinical practice or scientific inquiry. We try to approximate that, of course.
The church could say that we can't explain these circumstances, we can't explain this phenomena, say it's of divine origin. We don't know where it's from. It could conceivably say that, or it could say that God is manifesting himself here. And again, I think, as I said, I think that's as far as the church can go on it.
In fact, the principal aim of the church's investigation is to establish whether the religious teaching around seemingly miraculous events is in keeping with Catholic doctrine. A breach in the laws of nature need not be examined too closely. A breach in Catholic dogma is a far more serious matter.
Obviously, if there was a private revelation, and the person all of a sudden says, I was just inspired, or I heard God saying that there was really a fourth person of the Blessed Trinity, well, then the church would be very sure that that's not genuine or authentic.
They test claims based on how well they fit Catholic dogma, as opposed to how well they fit science, or how well the evidence stacks up. I think the scientific approach is the exact opposite. It's open-ended. You start with the evidence and let it lead to an answer.
Joe Nichol is a former Pinkerton private detective who spent many years as an independent investigator into miracles. He's yet to find one which didn't have a rational explanation.
Take this, all of you, and eat it.
In June 1996, the Mercy Foundation was filming Mass in the Santo's garage, which has been converted into a makeshift chapel. As Father Joyce, the Santo's spiritual advisor, consecrated the bread and wine, which Catholics believe actually turn into the body and blood of Christ, the Eucharist appeared to bleed.
It was only when he looked down did he notice what had taken place.
A miracle on camera? Before our very eyes?
I was flabbergasted. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do, but I knew a miracle was taking place there and something unusual was happening.
I came with half belief and half disbelief, and after seeing these personally, my faith has grown.
Because we see something with our own eyes does not mean that it actually happened, or we would believe that magicians actually saw people in half or caused them to float in the air. Not a single statue has ever been authenticated reliably by science to weep oil or to exude oil. Statues don't do this. Wafers don't exude blood either. People say, well, but if it does, then it's a miracle. But that begs the question, does it really do it? And if it does it, why does it not do it in a scientific laboratory?
But for all its rigor and use of respectable scientists, the Church's investigation is very different from a truly scientific inquiry. Faith allows for mysteries, while science tries, however unsuccessfully, to unravel them. A thorough study of the phenomena around Audrey, however, or questions as to who, if anyone, might be perpetrating some pious fraud, are simply not part of the Commission's remit.
We have seen the oil, and we have seen that kind of thing, but our approach really is to look more at the psychological dimensions than the physical dimensions.
I don't think you could ever prove a miracle. I think that to ask science to prove something is, as I think, forcing science outside of its realm. It just can't do that. It just, that's asking too much of it.
What should be required is that the person making the claim have the burden of proof, and one should investigate carefully, neither being too dismissive or too credulous. I believe that mysteries are meant basically to be investigated and solved. I think you could even say that civilization progresses as a series of solved mysteries.
In the past, freak phenomena have proved embarrassing to the modern Church. An investigation can dampen down enthusiasm and bring events under their control. But official statements about cases such as Audrey's are typically bland. Condemnation might disappoint those whose faith has perhaps been renewed by a visit to Audrey's bedside. But to acknowledge that the hand of God is at work in a Worcester suburb could be even more provocative.
Church is in a very, almost a no-win situation there. But it doesn't say you should believe. It just says that it's probable that these things happened. That may disappoint some who find that's, I just can't accept that. But it's beneficial to others who say, gee, there is something of substance here.
Very difficult for the Church, no matter how much science is invoked, no matter how much scholarship or skepticism is invoked. Ultimately, the Church cannot be too skeptical and still function as a church. It's just unfortunate that a pure, clear scientific investigation can't be made in such matters, and the truth be told quite emphatically and flatly.
But for all their equivocation in a case like Audrey's, there are times when the Church does state categorically that miracles are genuine. In the process of making saints, the Catholic Church has an extremely rigorous system employing many top doctors and scientists whose work is rarely revealed in public. In 1997, the Catholic Church officially declared that the unexpected recovery of this young Lebanese man from a deadly bone marrow failure was a miracle.
When I put on the robe, I felt fire and strength within me. I felt joy and happiness and serenity.
But the cure of André Najm was not only a blessing for him. It was a cause for great celebration amongst the 30% of Lebanese people who are Catholics, for it meant that one of their own priests from the last century could take the first step towards sainthood. In May 1998, thousands of the faithful from the Middle East crowded into St. Peter's Square in Rome for the beatification ceremony of Ni'matullah al-Hardini. Those who are beatified are held up as role models to Catholics and enjoy the title Blessed. It takes years of research for the Church to declare that a candidate for beatification led a life of so-called heroic virtue. But even then, confirmation of this judgment is required from the highest authority, a sign from God, a miracle. A second miracle is required for canonization, being made a saint. Only the Catholic Church requires miracles in the process of making saints, and it employs eminent scientists and doctors to corroborate the mysterious.
I've studied many cases. I've studied more than 400 cases during these more than 16 years. I'm president of the Consulta Medica, so I have studied every cases. And really, there are, I have discovered some incredible miracles.
كونوا في السكوت أيها السامعون.
The cure of André Najm, which confirmed the beatification of al-Hardini, was one of the most recent of these officially declared miracles. André was perhaps an unlikely candidate for a miracle. He lives in a middle-class area of Beirut, just round the corner from the Catholic school of Notre Dame, where he teaches religious instruction. Although in the best of health now, 10 years or so ago, he fell seriously ill.
I was 20 years old when I began to feel physically very weak. My face turned yellow. My body was covered in blue blotches. And I used to get very dizzy.
André was suffering from aplastic anemia, bone marrow failure. His low blood count meant frequent blood transfusions.
I needed blood transfusions like a car needs petrol. I had to be refueled with blood to stay alive.
Despite the privations of the Civil War, André's family still had enough money to send him to France for specialist treatment. But all the doctor's efforts were in vain, and eventually they gave up and just expected him to die.
There happened to be a priest in the hospital, and my father caught up with him and pleaded, "Give André the last rites. He is not long for this world."
Meanwhile, concerned neighbors had formed a prayer group for André. One of them suggested that they take him on a pilgrimage to pray at the tomb of the famous al-Hardini. Al-Hardini was a priest of the Maronite branch of Roman Catholicism, which had its beginnings in the Holy Valley of northern Lebanon. He was regarded by many as saintly even before he died here at Qfifan Monastery in 1858, though it wasn't until 1989 that the Church declared him venerable. This officially recognized his life of supreme holiness. But the huge popular demand for al-Hardini's beatification could not be satisfied until a miracle had been attributed to his intercession with God, if, for example, someone was cured as a result of praying to him. It was then that André Najm came to pray at his tomb.
He prayed, saying, "Lord, I have traveled near and far begging for blood. Give me a drop of your blood that was spilt on the cross. Give me a drop so that I may live."
André prayed wearing a robe of the kind that al-Hardini himself would have worn.
I felt a kind of heat inside my body. I felt a great joy and happiness, which I can't put into words. I wish there were a way of expressing what I felt. It transformed my weakness into strength. It turned the color of my skin from yellow to normal. And my dizziness completely disappeared.
Since the 30th of August, 88, I haven't given Andre any treatment. He came to me several times in 88, 89, and 90. I told him he was well enough to get married, which he did, and he now has 2 children. He's actually in very good health.
Professor Shaheen trained in Paris and is one of Beirut's most distinguished hematologists. He was perplexed by Andre's sudden recovery.
It's not up to me to judge if he was touched by a miracle. I'm a believer, but that did not affect my judgment. I simply found no medical explanation for Andre's cure.
Could this be regarded as the miracle everybody had been hoping for? In order to be authenticated, it had to be investigated by the Vatican's Sacred Congregation for the Causes of the Saints. It's by no means easy to get past the Church's miracle police.
We reject many cases because, in our opinion, are not. They have not the criteria of true miracles. So we prefer to say no.
The corridors of the congregation are rarely seen except by church insiders who are very secretive about their work and grant access to the media only very infrequently. The records and research materials preserved in the archive here deal with causes going back to 1588, from Al-Khardini to Joan of Arc and beyond. Because most miracles these days are medical cures, the congregation has since 1948 employed a medical board of over 60 members, many of them university professors and representing an immense body of medical expertise.
Are very highly qualified and recognized physicians in their field. We rely very much on their independence of judgment, which is backed up by their experience and by their own personal integrity.
Over 90% of claimed miracles are rejected by the congregation's officials before they ever reach the medical board. The board convenes to examine cases whenever the availability of its eminent members allows. The prestigious job of president is held by a leading liver transplant surgeon who has the final say on the medical evidence.
Now this is a case, you see exactly, this is another case. You see how it's full of data, how it's complete. So you have to work a lot to be sure of what are the conclusions. So this is it's a lot of work.
Those in charge of Al-Khardini's cause spent years gathering evidence about André Najm's cure for the board to examine.
When the Vatican started its investigation, I didn't just give them all my files. There was about 2 months of frantic activity. They interviewed a lot of witnesses, maybe 15 or 20 of them. At one point, they even accused me of not telling the truth.
I found them to be very, very rigorous and very strict. They looked at the medical records from all the doctors who saw André here and in France, including the biopsy reports. All this was then sent to the Vatican. It took almost 18 months, a year and a half of deliberations, and even then they waited for 10 years before declaring it was a miracle.
We try to get the very best specialist, and we never asked them, is this a miracle? That's not a question for the doctors to decide. We simply asked them, on the strength of your theoretical knowledge, on the strength of your experience, can you give us a medical explanation of this unexpected and rather spectacular cure?
In André's case, they couldn't. although aplastic anemia is known to remit under certain circumstances. But in any case, inexplicability is no proof of a miracle. This judgment is made by theologians. To verify the miracle needed to complete the beatification process, they had to show a cause and effect relationship between Andre's cure and the fact that he was praying to Al-Hardini at the moment it took place. For all the apparent appliance of science in the process of saint-making, when it comes to the crucial question, the Church keeps science firmly in its place.
We have to be careful here about not crossing over competencies, just as I would not ask a television cameraman how to perform brain surgery. I wouldn't ask a theologian to talk to me about medicine, or a doctor to talk about theology. We have to keep the division of competencies, but yet put them together to arrive at a judgment.
I guess the crucial difference between science and religion in the context of mysteries has to be that religion takes them as mysteries and leaves it at that and says that's the Almighty's workings at work. Science never stops asking the question why or what's going on here. It's constantly looking for deeper and deeper levels of explanation.
Attitudes to the literal reality of miracles focus the ancient conflict which many have seen between science and faith.
I think conflict is the wrong word to define the difference between science and faith. I think science has its competency, and I think faith continues where science must end.
But since the time of Copernicus and Galileo, such a harmonious relationship between science and faith has hardly been universally accepted. In 1748, David Hume wrote a classic treatise on the impossibility of miracles, at a time when many of the philosophers and scientists of the Age of Reason were trying to fit God into a new, rational worldview. Newton deplored the notion of miracles, but believed in God as a great mechanic in the sky. Descartes tried to find rational explanations for the gospel miracles. The feeding of the 5,000, he theorized, could be explained by Jesus' audience having been shamed into producing hitherto concealed picnics.
Most of the founding fathers of modern science, actually, Galileo and people like that, though again, they may have had their difficulties with religious authorities, were people for whom religion mattered. They like to say God had written two books, the book of nature, the book of scripture, you should read both, and that ultimately they must be consistent because they had the same author.
Something very similar happened in the Islamic world in the 8th and 9th centuries, when the Islamic world had their own enlightenment, and it was a time of huge scientific advances. And the great Arab scientists wanted to apply their new rationality to the God of the Quran, just as Newton wanted to tidy up the God of the Bible and make him a bit more rational. But after a couple of centuries, Muslims just gave up the whole idea. God, said the Islamic philosophers, was more of an art form. God was approached through the powers of the creative imagination, not through the powers of naked reason.
A church which places miracles at the core of belief cannot deny them. So why bother with science in the process of assessing miracles? There is debate about this even inside the church.
There are certain people who feel that we could do away with miracles, not because we do not believe in miracles. As Catholics and as a theologian, as a professor of theology, I do believe in miracles. That's not a question, but I am one of the people who would like to get away from the requirement, the necessity of a physical miracle. I think there are other divine signs which could be a sufficient confirmation.
As far as the requirement of miracles are concerned, I think it is pretty solid opinion held by the overwhelming majority of people that miracles are required for beatification and canonization, that they are divine confirmation of what is in effect a human judgment.
I have discussed this at length personally with the Holy Father, and he sees the difficulties because it's ever more difficult to provide a scientific proof of a miracle. He sees the difficulties, but he told me, well, in his opinion, the faithful today need to understand that God intervenes from time to time in the history of mankind.
There's no doubt that miracles are powerful stories to tell. In 20 years of globe-trotting evangelism, the current Pope has used saint-making to reinforce the Church, whether it be the Maronite minority in Lebanon, the faithful masses of South America, or the long-suppressed Catholics of the Eastern Bloc.
Canonization has always been a political process. The Pope, like all his predecessors, uses the canonization process to promote his vision of what the Church should be in the late 20th century, to give the faithful role models which will lead them into the type of Christianity that he wants to see practiced.
The statistics in this case are eloquent. Pope John Paul II, over the last 2 decades, has made over 1,000 blesseds and saints, more than all his 20th century predecessors put together. As the many miracles needed for these causes are declared genuine, science is paradoxically being used to lend authority to a quintessentially unscientific process.
I think that what's happening here is that the Catholic Church is trying to embrace science, to bring science into its orbit and make science work for it, to show that science and God are compatible.
The details of research into miracles by the Vatican's medical board are not made public. But the sanctuary of Lourdes, almost synonymous with miracle cures, is more open. There's been a medical investigating committee here for over 100 years, completely independent of the Vatican's saint-makers. The last Lourdes miracle declared genuine by the Church was the extraordinary recovery from a fatal bone cancer of a young Italian schoolgirl in 1976. How was it possible for the men of science who investigated her case to convince themselves that this cure was not just good fortune, but potentially miraculous? Every year, 5 million pilgrims come to Lourdes, to pray, to join in the torchlight processions, perhaps to hope for a miracle, though only 65 miracles here have ever been declared genuine. Pilgrims claiming cures are examined by the Lourdes Medical Bureau and then by an international committee. The investigating doctors are Catholics and work to a clear set of rules about what defines a miracle. But looking for evidence to fit pre-existing criteria while surrounded by an atmosphere of religious fervor is rather different from the usual scientific process of testing a theory by trying to disprove it. Dr. Michael Dewlake, a member of the Lourdes International Medical Committee, comes here to help with handicapped children.
I was inveigled into doing this by a friend who said they needed a doctor, and I thought, what am I doing, giving up a week of my hard-earned holiday time to come off with other people's snivelling kids? But it wasn't like that at all. It was a revelation. I thought it was going to be very ascetic, sackcloth and ashes, misery, and it was a marvellous party, and really like a second conversion.
Whatever the benefits of a trip to Lourdes, reports in the past have been critical of the Medical Bureau's investigations and those of the International Medical Committee, which comprises 30 specialists from several different countries. This has done little to diminish the sanctuary's popularity. Neither has the fact that Lourdes often seems more like a religious resort than a place of pilgrimage, or that modern miracles don't seem to be as dramatic as the ones in the Gospels. Many past Lourdes cures were from diseases that are now known to remit spontaneously.
One remembers the the French skeptic Anatole France, who, having gone to Lourdes and seen all the discarded crutches, said, "What? No wooden legs?" And if a miracle really happened, that would be the kind of proof that one would look for, would be the regeneration of a missing limb.
The story of the last recorded cure, which happened in 1976, however, seems on the face of it to be very remarkable. A young Sicilian girl, Delicia Chiroli, cured of a fatal cancer in her leg, with no treatment but a little Lourdes water. She had actually got better well after her visit to Lourdes, and returned with her mother only several months later to be assessed by the medical bureau. They were seen by the bureau's president, Dr. Théodore Mangiapane, who's written up her case in his book on the cures of Lourdes.
We had the opportunity of seeing her here in Lourdes, at the medical board, in July 1977. She was accompanied by her mother, who told us her story. But we might not have believed her had she not brought with her 2 sets of X-rays of the tumor on her shin bone.
The X-rays, taken some months apart, showed a remarkable recovery, which the International Medical Committee declared inexplicable 5 years later.
The medical board came to the conclusion that this was a clear-cut, ordinary and conclusive case of recovery by 1982.
Delicia Chiroli comes from a small hilltop town in Sicily, close to Mount Etna. She was only 11 years old and a schoolgirl when illness took hold.
Suddenly, one morning, I felt really ill. My knee hurt, and I had to come home from school because it was hurting so much. I used to tell my mum that I had these terrible pains, but she didn't take me seriously. She thought I was fibbing because I didn't want to go to school.
It soon became clear, however, that something was seriously wrong. A local pediatric surgeon, Quintino Mollica, performed a biopsy on Delicia's leg, and a malignant tumor was diagnosed.
I remember that in 1976, the standard method of treating skeletal tumors was particularly rigid and severe. So I proposed amputation of the leg, or alternatively, radiotherapy, because these tumors are particularly sensitive to radiotherapy.
The only solution was to amputate my leg, to give me a few more months to live.
But no more than 3 months. My husband said no. If the doctor can't tell us anything more positive, she might as well keep her leg.
Her parents did not want to accept that their child should be mutilated. I believe they may have thought it would be preferable for her to die at home, intact, as it were.
Neither did Delicia's parents want to add to her distress. She had become more and more terrified of hospital visits.
I couldn't accept it. Maybe because of the horrible pain. I was terrified of all those white coats. I was really scared.
Without treatment, Delicia seemed unlikely to survive for long. One of her teachers suggested a trip to Lourdes, which her mother had never heard of. But the sanctuary seemed to offer some small hope, and the local community clubbed together to pay for mother and daughter to visit for a week.
I was able to walk even though I was limping. One day they wanted to take me to bathe in the pools, but I didn't want to go because I was scared. In the end, a kind nun went with me so that I could bathe.
After that, we returned home. At home, she took to her bed. She was still ill. And then one day she was in so much pain that it seemed she was going to die, really die. I had already prepared the burial shroud.
Since their return from the sanctuary, Gaetana had been bathing Delicia's leg regularly in Lourdes water, but was hardly expecting it to do any good. Then, 4 months later, Delicia's condition began to improve.
It was in December that I felt like getting out of bed. Just like that. I just went into the kitchen and I said, "Mummy, I want to go out."
We realized that she was getting better day by day. X-rays showed that her knee was forming calcium. We began to hope that maybe we were witnessing a miracle.
A few months later, Gaetana returned to Lourdes with Delicia to report her extraordinary recovery to the medical bureau.
We were very interested and began to look for further details of the history of her illness. We were obliged to come to the conclusion that this was an extremely interesting case.
The doctors began their painstaking investigation. Delicia was now cured, so it first had to be established how seriously ill she had been to begin with. There had always been some dispute over exactly what kind of tumour Delicia appeared to have had. Eminent opinion was sought to try and resolve this question, but by this time only the original notes and slides from the affected bone were left for examination.
They had the original slides reviewed by many expert pathologists, but it appears that they were not given the opportunity of cutting further sections from the tumour and applying modern diagnostic techniques to those samples. And I would say that most experts now, if they're given a difficult case to diagnose, would always request further samples from the specimen taken at surgery on which to do further special tests before they give an opinion.
Nevertheless, the Lourdes medics were convinced that regardless of the exact diagnosis, Delicia was suffering from some kind of malignant tumour.
She had a malignant tumour. Whether it was a primary or secondary one is of no importance. Under normal circumstances, not having received any treatment, she would have faced certain death.
This assumes that the original documentation was interpreted correctly. There is a possibility that some other, perhaps tubercular infection, could have been responsible for similar test results. The fact that Delicia did get better, and without treatment, would lead most doctors to suspect not a miracle, but an unreliable diagnosis in the first place.
I would have to question the diagnosis of was it really cancer at the beginning, because from what I've seen of the documentation, there's not sufficient information to exclude other possibilities. So it could have been some sort of bizarre infection affecting the bone which just sort of burnt itself out. That's a possibility.
The criteria for investigating a possible miracle to which the Lourdes doctors work are based on a formulation by Cardinal Lambertini in 1734. The cure must be instantaneous, complete, and lasting. Given that medicine is often an inexact science, how much of a miracle is actually in the eye of the beholder? Do the Lourdes doctors interpret the facts to fit the criteria? That's a question that interests Dr. Peter May, who's been investigating claims of faith healing, including those at Lourdes, for many years. He's a GP, but also a member of the Church of England Synod.
The difficulty seems to be that having set out what the criteria are to decide whether this is an instantaneous complete cure of an incurable disease, they then seem to slip on things like, well, what does instantaneous mean? And Dr. Mangiapane said whole books have been written about that. Now, I think that's very odd to write very much about the word instantaneous.
I understand that the word immediate is used, but we doctors prefer the term without convalescence. We prefer to describe it as a cure that is unexpected, ultra-fast, without convalescence, without a threshold stage of getting better.
All we really know is that there came a point in time where that girl felt well enough to get out of bed. We do not know what was going on in her leg in the several months before this happened, or for the several months afterwards.
So the cure was not especially instantaneous, and in fact it was rather less than complete, since Delicia's leg had been left crooked by her illness, and she required surgery to straighten it.
There's no doubt in Delicia's case that her tumour has completely resolved. However, it has left her, or did leave her, with a seriously deformed leg, which I think, and if a medic is allowed to make theological observations, that's very odd of God to do such a miracle and leave such a deformity.
The Lourdes International Medical Committee's report concluded that Delicia's cure was inexplicable. The decision as to whether this could be considered a miracle lay with the Archbishop of the Diocese of Catania in Sicily, where Delicia lives.
After having reflected at length, after having prayed, I made an official decree. In my authority as a pastor, as a bishop of the church in Catania, I declared a miracle in the case of Delicia Chiroli.
Although the Archbishop appointed his own investigators, the Lourdes report would have weighed heavily in his decision. Some of its findings actually reinforce Dr. May's reservations, but they're likely to escape the untrained eye.
I think there is a bit of a cop-out from the Medical Bureau distancing themselves from the verdict of miracle. I can well understand that a given bishop might read a report like that and think, wow, this is impressive, whereas through medical eyes you think, not that impressive. This is a remarkable recovery, but you've got to get it in the perspective of the millions of people who go to Lourdes. And this is their best case. At least this is the one that Dr. Mangiapane says is the best case. And it isn't that impressive.
It's virtually impossible to suppress the popular desire for belief in the supernatural with either religious dogma or the evidence of science. Lourdes quickly became almost a part of the fabric of Catholicism, even though St. Bernadette's visionary claims were at first treated with great skepticism. New sites of pilgrimage are springing up all the time. Hundreds of thousands come to Medjugorje in former Yugoslavia every year, despite the fact that the Church has refused to authenticate its young so-called visionaries.
Medjugorje is a place that has attracted the multitude, and there has been what psychologists would call a contagion. I've used the term Medjugorje virus. It's amazing how many of the Virgin Mary sightings in the United States and elsewhere in the world, how many phenomena are associated in some way with Medjugorje.
Just one example of this contagion occurred recently in the town of Civitavecchia, just north of Rome. A cheap statue of the Virgin Mary, brought back as a souvenir from Medjugorje, was reported by a 5-year-old girl to be weeping tears of blood. Pilgrim numbers were hugely increased when the very bishop who was investigating the phenomenon actually claimed to have seen the little Madonna weeping blood himself. Tests have revealed nothing miraculous about this piece of kitsch, but no amount of scientific skepticism will affect the popularity of such apparent miracles.
I think people flock to these sensational events because they feel the divine is absent from their lives. They feel the divine is shadowy. They're used to reality, all reality, they think, being demonstrably, tangibly true. And so any hint that there's actually something you can touch and prove and point to it will draw them, because people are hungry for faith.
For he who believes, a miracle is not necessary. For he who does not believe, it is not enough.
Ironically, seemingly miraculous phenomena are often taken as a kind of empirical proof of the supernatural. But it may be self-destructive for traditional religion to try and use science in order to feed the desire for such certainty.
The more we kind of hang on to these literalistic beliefs and try and prove in God's existence, the more worried we're going to be. And the more worried we are, the more people will abandon their faith.
Next week's Equinox tells the story of the laser, from its invention in 1960 to its possible future uses. That's next Tuesday at 9 o'clock.